We affirm contention 1 is breaking barriers. Lifting sanctions on Venezuela breaks 4 barriers to the well-being in Venezuela and Latin America. First is restructuring. Weisbrot finds that Venezuela is attempting to restructure the debt prior to the placement of sanctions in 2017 by reaching deals with creditors to postpone payments in exchange for bonds. Unfortunately, sanctions preclude these efforts by preventing the country from participating in talks with U.S. financial institutions. Wigglesworth furthers that Russia and China, who are currently attempting to keep Venezuela afloat, don't have the resources to do so forever. In a world without sanctions, however, restructuring would occur. As Wheatley writes in 2018, that Venezuela is a profitable place to trade bonds, and investors are still interested in the region. Smith furthers in 2019 that Venezuela debt doubled following the placement of sanctions. He finds that a debt default is extremely likely in the year 2020, which would lead to a large-scale economic contraction. The time to act is now, as Mucci writes in 2019, that a debt restructuring would stabilize Venezuela's economy and lay the foundation for long-term economic health, doubling total growth. Johnson contextualizes the last time Venezuela instituted recovery programs, poverty was slashed 70%. Second is Madison. Sachs in 2019 finds sanctions have blocked access to essential life-saving medicines for Venezuelans by blocking access to funds needed to pay for them, thus dropping their imports over 5-fold. He finds that over 4 million currently lack the medicine they need. Lifting sanctions would resolve this. As Nebe in 2019 concludes, lifting sanctions would unlock $6 billion of frozen assets effectively covering Venezuela's medical needs. Buncombe in 2019 thus finds sanctions have resulted in 40,000 excess deaths in a single year, and that almost 300,000 more have been brought to the brink of death, isolating the lack of life-saving medicine and medical equipment as a major contributor. Third is PetroCaribe. Glickhouse in 2013 explains Venezuela launched PetroCaribe in 2005 as an energy bloc to provide low-interest oil sales to nearby countries facing expensive imports, allowing governments to pay for petroleum over time instead of all at once. During May 2013, leaders approved the PetroCaribe Economic Zone, which would promote investment, trade, tourism, and development in the 18 member countries. However, Bobbitt in 2019 indicates due to a nosedive in oil production and other economic constraints due to sanctions, PetroCaribe has rapidly deteriorated, shutting off the countries that want to continue PetroCaribe from taking a part in it. Charles in 2019 concludes that U.S. sanctions have functionally killed PetroCaribe by hurting fuel supply, debt payments, and shipping possibilities. Thus, countries have avoided any transactions with Venezuela in order to avoid the associated risks due to the unclear language of sanctions. Critically, the Caribbean Council in 2020 explains Maduro wants to revive PetroCaribe this year after the suspension of supplies due to sanctions. However, they conclude that it is unclear how the relaunch could be effective while sanctions remain in place because of the increasing pressure on the country and measures against other countries doing business with Venezuela. Crucially, the FAO in 2015 explains PetroCaribe was on the road to revitalize the whole region. The program combines social programs with productive development to take care of immediate issues of food security and hunger and deal with long-term underlying causes of starvation in the region, overall reducing hunger in the region by 50% and creating a food surplus of over 17%. The need to maintain and increase efforts to overcome hunger, however, has not gone away. As the UN finds in 2019, over 39 million people in Latin America are at risk of starvation. Fourth is water. Jordan in 2015 finds that the government of Venezuela implemented new campaigns to fix water infrastructure that boosted Venezuelans' access to clean drinking water to 95% as of 2015 before sanctions. Green in 2019 corroborates sanctions block the country from acquiring new pumps, motors, pipes, and replacement parts. Despite the Venezuelan government doing what it can to mitigate the situation, it has been impossible to buy pumps because anytime the country tries to buy supplies, the companies or countries trying to help have been blocked by sanctions or they get sanctioned by the U.S. Even if Venezuela could get the money abroad, the U.S. has threatened to sanction any foreign company for doing business with the country. That's why Rendon in 2019 finds 80% of Venezuelans do not have access to stable drinking water, as it has now become a luxury. This crisis also affects farmers' ability to irrigate crops, so national production in agriculture has fallen 60%. This crisis are having a long-term effect, as Nichols in 2019 concludes that 4.3 million people are in critical need of water, and Stott 19 concludes that 8 million people lack access to food in Venezuela due to Trump's embargo, meaning millions will suffer irreversible damage. And critically, Hines in 2019 finds that the upcoming famine in a few months will cause hundreds of thousands of deaths. Independently stable water is good for the economy, as the CSD finds investing in improved water infrastructure provides both immediate and long-term economic growth that could boost the GDP by 3.7%. Thus, we affirm.
I want to see one Maduro wants to resign, and also to clarify, what was the 50% thing? Just like what did it say?
Oh, last time when PetroCaribe was not under sanctions, it reduced hunger and division by 50%. So you want to see 50%, and then what was the other one?
I want to see the card that says that Maduro wants to revive PetroCaribe.
Yeah. So I'll show you PetroCaribe first.
And I'll show one more card after, but I'll see this one.
PetroCaribe. Top part is it's not going to relaunch. First part is that they want to.
So it's all this card though?
Yeah. And then the bottom one's about ours.
No.
16 seconds.
We got 12.
Oh, okay, sure. And then
The next one is
50%.
no, I don't want to see that. I just want to clarify that one. I
Oh,
want to
okay.
see the default is likely in 2020.
Sure. Let's go.
Time starts now. Alright, that was 9 seconds.
25.
12 plus 9 is 21. Time starts now.
Oh, poverty
Yeah,
set.
5 seconds.
Alright, everyone good? We negate. Contention 1 is ruining reform. Sanctions are driving Venezuelan economic reform in 2 key areas. Subpoint A is about diversification. Venezuela's dependence on oil is holding back economic growth. Bornstein of Kellogg explains in 2017, oil is extremely volatile because of frequent fluctuations in demand and shocks in prices. Nitzberg 18 furthers that a lack of diversification has left Venezuela's economy in ruins. Luckily, the country is on the path to recovery. As Armas of Reuters finds in 2019, the U.S. sanctions have hurt Venezuela's petroleum sales, and during hard currency, Venezuela has stepped up exports of food and other resources in an effort to diversify. However, absent pressure from sanctions, diversification stops. As Wilg of the Mickelson Institute writes in 2012, resource dependence is not a coincidence, but a strategic pursuit by government elites to limit the extent to which political opponents can challenge their power. When there are alternative sources of income, it is made easier for others to accrue influence and oppose Maduro. Devastatingly, due to dependence on oil and the crisis, Kaylee Green of the Daily Signal reports that 90% of Venezuela lives in poverty. Diversifying is key, as the World Bank finds without proper economic diversification, countries are more vulnerable to external shocks that can undermine prospects for long-term growth. Our second subpoint is about privatization. Venezuela's oil industry is in a difficult situation. Alima Vox reports in 2017 that PDVSA, Venezuela's state-owned oil company, suffers from a bloated workforce of inexperienced employees who only serve to consolidate Maduro's power. As a result, Francisco Minaldi of Forbes finds in 2019 that no new major oil projects have been developed since 2005. Fortunately, sanctions are forcing Venezuela to change. Alvarez of Venezuela Analysis writes last week, sanctions have made it difficult for PDVSA to contract out oil operations. And as a result, Argus Media concludes last December, Venezuela has increased oil production by 800,000 barrels per day by quietly transferring control to private partners. Thus, Cohen of Reuters writes in 2020 that PDVSA is no longer producing and is instead undergoing a de facto privatization of its industry. Crucially, Pittis of CBC finds in 2019 that the key to getting Venezuela's economy back on track is to bring in private companies that are more concerned with profits and less about corruption. Improving the economy is critical, as the World Vision quantifies the economic crisis has pushed over 4 million people into poverty. Overall, Argus Media notes in December that as a result of sanction-induced reforms, food and medicine imports have rebounded and hyperinflation has fallen. Lopez of Venezuela Analysis furthers in 2019, the economy will grow by a projected 4% in 2020, representing a shift away from economic disaster. Contention 2 is inviting intervention. Ending sanctions against Venezuela will force America to take military action. Josh Rogan of the Washington Post writes in 2018, the U.S. has called Venezuela a part of the troika of tyranny in Latin America and pledged to confront the oppressive regime. Indeed, the U.S. has been using sanctions to pursue a campaign of maximum pressure against Maduro. However, Alex Ward of Vox finds in 2019, America's strong and reckless rhetoric has placed itself in a double bind. The U.S. must double down on pressuring Venezuela or risk a foreign policy failure. That would jeopardize Trump's re-election. As Tony Schaefer of the Miami Herald writes in September, pressure on autocratic regimes reflect key American principles that could strengthen Trump's re-election bid. Specifically, a hardline stance on Venezuela is key to winning Florida, a swing state that has decided 11 of the last 12 elections and one that Trump has made central to his campaign. Lindsay Singleton of The Hill confirms in August, the Trump administration's hawkish and aggressive approach to Venezuela is driven by the role Florida will play in 2020. Thus, without sanctions, the U.S. will be forced to turn to a military intervention. As Dan Eberhard of Forbes finds in 2019, the U.S. has few tools available before a military option is the only one left. Without sanctions, the only possible other option is military intervention, as all others have been exhausted. Devastatingly, Frank Moore of Foreign Affairs finds in 2019 that the U.S. would intervene through a precision bombing campaign, and the result would be years of fighting and rebuilding. Overall, Ward of Vox quantifies that this military intervention would spark a civil war due to infighting, putting the entire country at risk. For these reasons, please negate.
Do you mind if I see two pieces of evidence?
Sure.
They're kind of, so first, actually just one.
Okay.
It's the imports part of the impact of the privatization argument that imports will be allowed and they privatize.
Imports have increased?
Yeah, okay, or that, yeah.
How much was that?
It was 5.
Do you mind if I have the first question?
No, I don't mind.
All right. When the Trump administration decided to assassinate the Iranian general, what did we use?
What did we use? Like an airstrike?
Yeah, so why can't we just quickly drone strike Maduro? Why does it have to be a full bombing campaign and then a full intervention?
Our evidence indicates that in
So
Venezuela.
yeah, I
they
know.
would
Give me
most
the
likely-
reason why.
I mean, I don't know the exact reason. I'd
So
say
you
they.
don't know why we
they
fully
could-
intervene, lose American troops, and
Oh no, I never
isolate
said
the
anything
back
about troops. We said a precision bombing campaign. It doesn't require.
wait.
troops.
Why does a bombing campaign need to cripple an already deteriorating country?
Alright.
Why do we need to use specifically bombing campaigns? Why
Alright,
can't we
so
send
if you-
special operations like we've
Yeah.
done in the Middle East, in all of our history?
All right. So number one, we would probably use a bombing campaign because it doesn't require us to risk losing our troops. Number two, the Iran
about a drone
situation.
strike?
Can I finish real quick? Yeah. So the Iran situation is different because we were targeting one person. We're talking
Yeah, why
about
are
the
we talking
entire
about
regime.
Maduro?
We're talking about the entire regime.
But
They're spread out
the
across
regime
the country.
collapses if Maduro is gone, correct?
No, not necessarily. He has
Why not?
inner circle military members that can prop him up too. So we have to destroy
Well,
multiple
yeah,
people across
prop
the
him
country.
up. If the head falls, then the rest of the pawns.
I mean,
go
they
down
probably
with it.
want to stay in power too, right? But on top of that, we would say even if there's a drone strike, that would be pretty bad too.
How much will the drone strike though?
I would say when Maduro dies, it would destabilize the country. There's a power vacuum. People want to get in
So
power.
how many
There's
people will die?
a civil war put the entire country at risk.
Wait,
I don't know if
wait.
you want me to quantify how many people would die in
Yeah,
a civil war.
I
Okay,
do.
sure. 30 million people. It's the population of Venezuela. Can I take a question?
Seems pretty improbable. Yeah, you can have a question.
All right. So on your argument about debt restructuring, why does it matter if Venezuela is already defaulted on its debt?
Yeah, our evidence indicates that all of these investors do not want to lose all of their money, but they're getting very tired with Venezuela.
No, but they
Our
already
evidence
defaulted.
our evidence is very explicit, saying that PDVSA is about to default on their debt.
No,
In
they
fact-
already defaulted.
No, they haven't. In fact, our evidence indicates that the bond, the people who have the creditors, are accelerating the bond doing, and there's $1.8 billion due right now.
I mean,
So-
they've already defaulted on $60 billion in debt, right?
I mean,
so my question
Yeah.
is, when
exactly. We're saying that the bond is maturing in 2020. That's one thing. Two, bond holders, creditors want to get their money. Three, our argument is that Maduro and Guaido, whoever
Right,
in
so-
Venezuela, wants to renegotiate their debt. That's why they're talks.
you didn't let me
However,
finish
our
my
evidence
question,
is
yeah.
very specific in indicating that the sole reason why they cannot is because of sanctions.
Yeah,
Can
so
I get a question?
You didn't let me finish my question, right? So my question is, since
You
they've
just
already
said they
defaulted, my question is, since they've already defaulted, what's the incentive to restructure the debt? Because once you default on your
Yeah.
debt, creditors now
Maduro
have
wants to,
legal backing to
Guaido
seize
wants
your
to,
assets.
Investors want to.
Why do investors want to when they can just seize assets? Because when they debt restructure, they lose something,
Yeah.
right? They have to
So,
give up something
yeah,
and
so
compromise, but they have
they-
legal
yeah,
backing to
yeah,
seize
yeah.
assets.
If you,
What's the
okay,
incentive?
I can answer. So one, Venezuela has the largest oil and iron reserves. They want to maintain a good nature with Venezuela,
Why
so
don't
that
they
if
just
they want to get future
Seize
debt,
the oil assets then. They have legal backing to do
one,
so.
they're not. There's no. I mean, if you can read a piece of evidence that says that,
I'm
that's
just
fine.
asking you for
Yeah.
the logic.
Yeah.
but
So the
reasons
reason
why they would
why
restructure.
is because they want to maintain good relations with the Venezuelan government. One, two, they still want to have the debt holdings over Venezuela, because if they have their debt over Venezuela, it's still a profitable investment.
It's
It's
probably
like
more profitable to seize assets,
there's
right?
a 14% annual return on their bond growth. Can I get a quick?
Sure.
That's time. All right. What do you want to know?
Sound good?
Wait, actually, never.
That was additional 14, so now we're at a minute 33.
Oh.
It's going to be straight down my opponent's face. Are my opponents ready?
Yeah.
Pardon me? All you? All three of the judges? Alright, let's get started. Start off on my opponent's first contention about reform. The really important thing to note here is that sanctions are not needed to force reform, as Coroner finds in March of 2017 that reforms were in fact happening before sanctions were in place, including both diversification and negotiations with the private sector, combining up to 48 different deals with the private sector. What that means is that sanctions are not specifically needed to force reforms, and that's proven by the status quo, which means it outweighs on probability because we know it's already happened. Going to the first argument about diversification, there's a lot of problems here. First, you can turn the argument against them, as Dial finds in 2019 that yes, Maduro is diversifying, but not in a way that helps the people. Rather, he's diversifying more and more into illicit ways of making money, specifically drugs and selling of illicit gold. That's not helping anybody. He's just going to more and more illegal methods. Additionally, Venezuela can never truly diversify because they only specialize in producing oil instead of industries like agriculture and manufacturing. I would argue that investors or people that want to buy like agricultural processes will always go to countries like in Asia and Africa because they have the comparative advantage in making it, and they make it much more efficiently, and it's much more cheap to buy. That's why Venezuela has been a petrostate. The reason why is because the only resource that they have an abundance of is oil. There's nowhere for them to go. But then you can turn it against them, as Sanchez finds in 2019 that thousands of educated people are leaving Venezuela due to sanctions, accounting to 10% of their entire population. That means that these companies, that these new diverse companies that are going to pop up, will lose their innovation and leadership when you vote for them, but those people come back when you vote for us, because then we provide them an economic place where there's new jobs that are being created and they have an incentive to come back. Then, Rockwell finds in 2018 that Chavez, who is Maduro's predecessor, actually relied on oil revenues for diversification. That's really critical because sanctions specifically target the oil industry and bring down exports. That's why oil revenues are lower than they ever have been in Venezuela, and they're not able to diversify. Going to their second argument about privatization, there's a lot of problems here, and the biggest is from the Venezuelan analysis, who finds in the year 2019 that sanctions recently got expanded to the private industry as well. That means that every single part of the Venezuelan economy is being contracted by sanctions. There's nowhere to privatize because the private companies are also being recipients of sanctions. But then the IMF, they tell you that the economy will grow by 4%. That's not true. The IMF finds in December of 2019 that they're projected to be a 10% contraction of the Venezuelan economy in 2020. We prefer this because their evidence is from an independent Venezuelan economist, while ours is from an international source of the IMF that's really respected worldwide. Additionally, I'd argue that the thing we talked about in our first argument about imports, which is secondary sanctions, prevents privatization. What that means is that countries do not want to deal with Venezuela in fear of being sanctioned by the U.S., which just happened to Russia right now, is already being proven by this history. Additionally, they tell you that the oil industry will be helped by privatization. That's not true, as oil was doing just fine before sanctions, but Rendon finds in 2019 that there's 67% less exports specifically because of sanctions. That's why the oil industry is collapsing now. Additionally, they tell you that imports have increased into Venezuela. We called for their evidence. Their evidence literally says that only 15% of the population can actually access these imports because they're still so expensive. The only way to allow imports to come in cheaply is by lifting sanctions and voting pro. Going to their second argument on intervention, a lot of problems here. First, Friedman finds in 2019 that the Trump administration does not want war in Venezuela, as both Trump and the old security advisor John Bolton have been trying a, quote, rhetorical regime change approach. The former director of Trump's South American Council told him that, quote, if you yell loud enough and threaten enough, maybe the regime will collapse. The administration is not prepared to send in troops and is approaching the other extreme of not talking to Venezuela and pretending that they never placed sanctions in the first place. There's no chance of a war happening. Additionally, USA Today finds in 2019 that war is bipartisanly unpopular in Congress, where both Republicans and Democrats are against it. That means that if a war were to happen, it'd have to be passed in Congress, and it's not going to happen because both Republicans and Democrats don't want it. But then you can turn it then go into their argument about how Trump needs to win Florida to win the re-election. Oppenheimer finds in 2019 that a military intervention might be popular in Florida, but it's widely unpopular elsewhere because it goes against Trump's policies of isolationism in America first. Thus, Oppenheimer concludes that a military intervention is extremely unlikely. Then, a military intervention would be extremely short if it even happened because Isaacson finds in 2019 that civilian casualties would be in the low thousand and open hostilities would end quickly, as the Maduro regime would largely collapse under intense military pressure. So even if you buy their argument, it's going to be very short term. Additionally, they never tell you why we have to go in militarily. We can just use special operations or a drone strike. Why does it have to be a bombing campaign?
Can I see some evidence? The 2019
first response on privatization that says sanctions expanded into the private sector.
Yeah.
Oh, and sorry, reforms in 2017 before citing the
okay,
first
yeah.
piece of evidence.
I got you.
Yeah.
That's the card.
This is the current section.
Yeah. And I got right after that. I got my reforms.
Is there like a specific part that there's a big paragraph? The first paragraph, right? Time starts now.
Is the private sector one?
It's the first one.
I think yeah, that's fine.
Is there
Yeah, the other one was
Okay.
reforms.
Oh,
That
yeah.
was 8 seconds.
8 seconds.
Yeah.
Oh, you're starting it before we like read.
Yeah, I told you.
Okay, you can
So it's this big one.
It's this one. Yeah, you could say March 28th. That is cool.
Time starts. Yeah. Where does it say privatization specifically?
Yeah, I'll show you.
That's 4 seconds.
Here it is.
No, it's in the bottom.
Yeah, here it is. I got it.
And then,
So I said 48 agreements, private companies right here.
and then the bottom said that there was an expo that was attended by a
Yeah, you can see that the top is what the 48 deals right there.
Time starts.
And we can show you like what
Alright.
areas.
That was total 6 seconds, so 14 seconds total. 35, 21, 35 total. Alright. We'll continue to spread.
What's the 67%? Oh, that was like those. Can't diversify. What is leaving to say? Oh, yeah, no, it's because I come to crisis. That's fine, we can see that. So those 3 responses. Okay, only 15% of max, but like the trajectory. Oh, can we see I math 10% contraction?
Yeah.
Was this a continuation of the previous
No,
paragraph?
no, no.
Oh, you were saying.
Yeah, so that was it.
Yeah. I'm just gonna.
Alright, time starts.
Okay, yeah. Oh, wait, see.
PDSA top of the 117 plus the. Oh, okay, that's fine.
Sure.
Another 2 seconds, 118? Okay, yeah. So, okay, sure.
Sure, 23.
Okay, sure. Yeah, sure.
That doesn't matter.
Well, that's perception.
Alright, so we've used. Yeah, what? So no, that was 32. So 132 plus 35. So we have like a minute 55 left.
A minute 35?
Minutes.
Yeah, sure.
132 is
Yeah,
There's like a minute left.
Yes, you have
a minute left. Yeah.
We need a pen.
You need a pen?
So the order is going to be frontlining our case and then going down theirs. Okay. start with reform. The first response is that there was negotiations with the private sector. That's just negotiations, but our evidence is about transferring assets to the private sector. That's completely different. That's not responsive. On diversification, they read a couple of terms. The first term talks about how they're going to elicit revenue streams. They don't tell you how much worse it's getting. They don't read an impact off of this. You can't give them offense for this. The second response says, the second term says that like the reason why a lot of brain drains are leaving is because of sanctions. However, the reason why a lot of technicians are leaving is because of the economic crisis, not because of sanctions. They also don't implicate this at all. You should not evaluate this. Go to privatization. There are three responses. Their first response says that there was expanding sanctions have been expanded to the private industry, but their evidence is only about agriculture. It's not about oil, and our uniqueness literally disproves their link because they're literally going to the private sector right now. Their second response says there's fears of getting sanctions, but our evidence literally says that privatization is happening right now. That disproves any counterclaim they give you. They don't read any evidence of this either. The third response says there's 67% less imports. That's from 2018, but our evidence from much recent in 2019 says that their imports have like currently rebounded. I would say their evidence is super outdated. On the index, they basically said that like our evidence says that there's only 15% of access to imports, but it doesn't matter. There's only 15%. The trajectory of imports is heading to is increasing, so which means that it might be 15% now, but later it's going to increase because they're privatizing more and more. That's going to fall back in the long term. Then they try to indict our evidence about 4% growth by saying that the IMF says that it's going to grow by 10%. However, I would argue that their evidence literally doesn't give a warrant, and our Lopez evidence is far better because it's from a PDVSA executive who defected, who has a lot of insider information, who knows a lot better about the company than their IMF study does. On military intervention, there are three responses. The first response says it's just a rhetorical regime change, but that's under the status quo. Our argument is that it completely changes when you end sanctions because there's no other option left. Their second response says that wars is very unpopular among Congress. However, Trump doesn't need congressional approval. He can just use the AUMF to get like a 90-day exemption without like needing to go to Congress. He can do it if he has the incentive to. Their third response says that it's widely unpopular. I would argue that one, the people in the other state don't really care about what happens in Venezuela, but two, they don't actually have to send in troops, so it wouldn't be unpopular. But three, it doesn't matter because Trump sees Florida as like the key state in the election. What matters is perception, not what's actually true. Then they say that the civilian casualties are going to be low, maybe from the initial strike, but our argument is that it destabilizes the entire region because now there's going to be different factions fighting against each other after the military bombing, which means that they're going to get far worse. On to their case. Starting with restructuring, a couple of responses. First of all, I would say that their widespread evidence says that they were simply trying to delay the restructuring by getting new bonds. However, this is really problematic because even if they got the new bonds to restructure later, they would have just defaulted on these bonds too, so it's not long term. The second response comes from Ellsworth of 2019, who says that as long as Maduro's in power, there's no restructuring because he's not a serious negotiator, because one, he has nothing to offer in return restructuring, and two, investors don't actually trust his promises. That's why Lowenthal says that as long as Maduro's in power, there's no restructuring, they can't solve for the problem. Third response comes from Coppola, who explains that it's not helpful to address restructuring without addressing the economic collapse that caused the restructuring to begin with. If you solve the restructuring, if you restructure now, they're just going to default at a later date. It's not long term. Go to their second argument about medicine. There's two responses. First of all, medicine was dropping far before sanctions in 2016. Imports dropped by 71%. There's clearly some alternative cause. You don't know how much better it gets in their old. But second response comes from Argus, which means that the uniqueness shows that the imports are rebounding right now. We're solving back in the status quo. Maybe at first it decreases, but right now it's increasing. Go to their third argument about Petrocaribe. A couple responses. First, Mugen tells you that Petrocaribe was failing before sanctions, which means that even if we end it now, it's going to collapse either way. But the second response from oil price, which says that if they're absent Petrocaribe, they're just going to shift to renewables, which means they can still get these energy sources to solve for the poverty impact that they're talking about. The third response comes from Mugen again, who explains that there's a lot of like high levels of debt to the Petrocaribe program because they still have to pay back for Petrocaribe, which means that overall it's not going to help with the economy. It's going to buy back in the long term. On water, there's a lot of alt causes to why water is doing really bad. First of all, Lai tells you that they gave control of the water to the military, who literally blocks people from getting access to it. Second of all, Brennan gave you two other reasons. First of all, he explains that there's a lack of social infrastructure. Even if they have the hard infrastructure, they don't have the organizations that can distribute the water effectively, which means that they can't solve back for it. But the second response is brain drain. There's a lot of like lack of technicians right now, which means that they're not able to actually put the infrastructure into place, even if you buy that they get it. But the third response says that UNICEF already gave like 2.8 million people access to water. Is clearly non-unique. And on their argument about agriculture, I would say they don't actually need drinking water. They can use water from like canals. But the second response is that there's a lot of rain too, so they can still get agriculture either way. I think some questions.
Yeah.
You want water? Okay. So your 4% evidence, you just told me that it comes from a PDVSA executive, which is the largest oil company in Venezuela. Isn't it in his best interest to make people think that the economy is growing so more people invest in his company?
No, because he defected.
He defected?
Yeah.
So is he like an ex-Venezuelan oil executive? Okay, I'll see that.
So he has a lot of insider information, so
that's
more
fine.
reliable. Okay.
wait, real quick. What insider information? Like, if we say I'm an oil exec,
Yeah.
how does that make me know, just automatically know more than anybody, the entirety of the economy? Because I don't know.
No, like
That seems a little bit
he
impossible.
basically knows that Venezuela is currently privatizing a lot.
And how did he use that information to justify a 4% increase in GDP? Where did the 4% come from?
I mean, like, he probably studies economics too. Like, he knows that because Venezuela is privatizing at like this rate, the economy is projected to grow, contrary to like what your evidence actually says.
So he only looked at privatization, didn't look at any other factors that could impact.
I mean, like, he came to that conclusion like specifically because of privatization, I would say. You can call it evidence. I think it's really good.
Okay.
All right, let's talk about some of your arguments. Right.
Mhm.
Let's start on this restructuring plan. So your argument is that they're gonna like delay this like payment for bonds by giving them more bonds, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so if they pay back the bonds right now with the bonds you're talking about, how are they gonna like pay back the bonds that they've used?
No, so right now the Venezuelan economy, they're not in the place where they can pay back on bonds, right? So our argument is that by lifting sanctions, you A, put them in the place where they can do so, and B, you make it so they have to pay it back later.
Yeah,
Also, there's negotiations where they can use oil as collateral and give it to to these countries that they owe debt to, and then they don't need
Wait, they can give oil as collateral right now.
No, they can't because
Why?
A, countries can't negotiate with Venezuela right now because of sanctions, and B, they can't
Why can't they
export
give
oil.
like shares of like Citgo or like some other company?
Because
Right
they don't
now?
have to, because Russia, it's a, like, that, what does that have to do
That's
with
like
anything?
part of the debt plan. Like if they fail to pay back, they can just get
That's
parts of
still
Citgo.
being
They can
blocked
do
by
that right now.
sanctions. I'm gonna take a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so let's talk about medicine, right? Sure. You tell me that imports are rebounding right now.
Yeah.
So if there's an increase in imports, but they're only going towards the people who can buy them, why does it matter if 90% of Venezuelans are in poverty?
What do you mean?
You tell me that only 15% of the population can access them. I assume that means the upper 15%. If 90% of Venezuela is in poverty, why does that matter?
Wait, our argument is that even though imports may have been like less, right now because they're privatizing, accessing revenues through the private sector, now imports have rebounded. They
Can you tell me how privatization makes
Yeah,
it so
of course. There's a
interesting?
couple of reasons. First of all, when you're privatizing, the president sells off part of PDVSA, which is like instant cash for them, which they can use to like get more imports. But additionally, the private sector like has to pay like tax too, like they pay like income tax. Like for example, like Amazon pays tax to the U.S. government, and also there's a lot of like workers that they can hire to like they can hire a lot of workers in Venezuela who can then spend money, and the government gets revenue through like tax.
So I get more money and I hire more workers. If imports are literally blocked by another government, how does having more money solve that? Because the reason why they can't deal with Venezuela is because sanctions block the flow of imports.
I
So
mean,
if I
like
have
the
more
food
money,
and
how does that solve
medicine imports are just completely exempt this time.
So
Can I see the 4%?
Yes.
So it's two pieces of evidence. One of them's talking about the PDVSA executive, and the other guy's like a Venezuelan economist, specifically in Venezuela. You want me to just show you both?
That's fine, yeah.
All right. So. Okay. This like did like a secret interview, basically.
Okay.
And then the other one like cites privatization as the reason why 4%. Yeah.
Okay.
Alright.
How much pepper was that?
It's like in combining the prep use at the very beginning. It's 8%, so.
can I see that they're privatizing right now?
It's Which piece of, we read two pieces of evidence to say that.
Showing everyone like more explicitly, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go.
Oh, the other one? So you want to see? Huh?
Yeah.
Sure. We'll see what happens. How much do y'all have?
It'll be on the affirmative case and then the negative case. Sorry?
Yes, now.
All right. Start on the affirmative case. Data only turns on any of our arguments. I'm going for the second argument about medicine. Our argument is very simple. The United States uses sanctions on Venezuela to cripple their pharmaceutical industry and to decrease the amount of imports. They read two responses. First, they say previous to sanctions, it was far below for 71%. Three responses here. First, our evidence is way more specific. It indicates that after sanctions were passed, imports went from $11 billion to $2 billion. Sure, it may have been decreasing, but the rate was still increasing before sanctions. Two, we would say $11 billion to $2 billion is still a five-fold decrease, which empirically proves sanctions are net worse. But then secondly, Rodriguez in 2019 says that oil rebounded in 2018 because of an oil boom, which means that sanctions placed on Venezuela prevented them from capitalizing on the oil boom. They tell you themselves oil is volatile. So in 2018, when there was an oil boom that made Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi very rich, they would have been able to capitalize it and rebound their exports. But third, on the corner evidence that's basically conceded on the top of their case, which says Maduro was privatizing and passing 48 deals in places like food production, agriculture, and other sectors of the government, which means those reforms would have translated into economic recovery, meaning they would have had imports, they would have increased the number of imports. They concede all of our warrants. First is the Sachs evidence, which says that sanctions have blocked access to essential life-saving medicine by decreasing imports by fivefold. That's because A, they sanction other countries that want to trade, but B, other countries know that they might get hit with the United States sanctions. That's why Emory evidence concludes that when you lift sanctions, it would unlock $6 billion of frozen assets. Independent of trade, we would say these frozen assets would also rebound imports. That's why our Buncombe evidence finds that sanctions have directly resulted in 40,000 excess deaths, and almost 300,000 more have been brought to death, and 4 million people lack the medicine they need. This outweighs in a few ways. First is on magnitude, because 40,000 people have died, whereas in their case, they talk about like economic growth that could or could not come. But then on probability, because we say that they concede all of our impact evidence, and people are dying right now, whereas you don't know if the economy is going to go up, and you don't know whether an intervention is going to happen. Also, they say that imports are rebounding. One, it's to 15% of the population. It's not to the majority of the population. Two, they don't tell you how much it's going to increase. Now to their case. On diversification, they can see the Rockwell evidence, which is a turn. It says that in order to diversify, you need to rely on oil revenue. However, sanctions decrease the oil exports by 67%. In order to diversify in the long term and help privatization, you need to have oil revenue that only comes in the app world, which means that we access their impacts. That decreases dependence, and when you have a decrease in dependence, you lift 90% of their population out of poverty. Go to the second argument about privatization. They say that our argument is about oil, about pharmaceuticals and agriculture. No, it's just the warrant still stands that the United States is extending it to the private sector because they're trying to kill Maduro. That's why I went from oil, gold to pharmaceuticals. It's still happening. But two, their evidence is bad. One, because their oil exec it doesn't say anything about 4% growth. It's another economist. They're conflating two pieces of evidence. Also, the IMF study still stands. They say there's no war. They measure imports, hyperinflation, and their de facto thing is not official. It doesn't matter. Go to their second argument of military intervention. One, they can't use the AMF because Venezuela doesn't have any terrorist organizations. Hezbollah is not Al-Qaeda. But then the Isaacson evidence on the impact is conceded. It says our argument is that destabilization wouldn't be bad because Guaido is still in power too. U.S. resources and military intervention supported. Also, like Trump wants to focus on other things. It's a rhetorical regime change.
Was there evidence for the second response of military intervention?
What?
See that one?
Yeah, what is the
Your second response you said in summary.
Yeah.
What was it?
But basically the last response, something like, I didn't really catch it. Like,
The rhetorical regime change?
No, that was the one before that.
the one that
the
you,
USA Today is not popular with Congress. And
the second response, the final
After
response
the
you extended in summary, after Venezuela has no terrorists.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was the Freiburg. It was rhetorical regime change.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Alright.
You want to see that?
Yeah, let's see it for sure. Yeah.
Time starts now.
Okay.
Wait, what was the last response? Like, was that the last response you
I
read?
extended 3 responses. First is the rhetorical regime change. The second was that it's not popular with Congress, so we can't use the AMF because Hezbollah is not Al-Qaeda. And then the Isaacson evidence, which says that Maduro would collapse because Guaido is still in power and the U.S. resources and military are too strong.
Okay, that's fine.
And then
We'll start prep now. Let's prep.
Is everyone ready?
Sir?
I said, is everyone ready? I'm starting on the neg case.
Yes. Hold on.
All good? Time begins. On our case, on the term that they say they need oil revenue, they don't gain access to the term because they can see the analysis from case that indicates PDVSA is collapsing right now because they're mismanaged. They don't solve for the root cause of mismanagement. Which in the long term, they don't get any. The root cause isn't sanctions; it's mismanagement. So they don't get any long-term revenues, which they can't diversify. You don't vote off of this term. Go to our second contention about military intervention. They extend 3 responses. The first is that's a rhetorical regime change, but this pretty much just concedes our analysis. Right now, he's using rhetoric because he's using rhetoric and he's using sanctions to pressure the regime. But without sanctions, then he has to keep up his rhetoric. He doesn't want to lose credibility, which is why he has to turn to the only other option. They can see the Eberhard evidence, which indicates without sanctions, the only option is military intervention. So he has to turn to that to save face. Then the next response is that he can't use AMF because there's no terrorists. But Venezuela has Hezbollah in the region, so they can obviously just blame it on Hezbollah. But in addition, the U.S. has always used AUMF to justify interventions, even when there were clearly no terrorists. Historical precedent proves our argument. Then the third response comes after time, but it's basically that Maduro will get out of power. But our argument is that it would destroy a lot of infrastructure and cause a power vacuum, which would destabilize the entire region, causing a civil war because Maduro supporters don't want to get overthrown by Guaido. At this point, it's a very clean extension for us. The broken evidence indicates that we're using maximum pressure, but that's problematic because the Ward evidence indicates that we can't lift our pressure. We have to keep doubling down. And the Singleton evidence says we need a hardline stance against Venezuela to appease voters in Florida. Trump would do that because the Eberhard evidence indicates that the only option without sanctions is a military intervention. That would be really bad because they can see the Moore analysis, which indicates we would do a precision bombing. But even if we do like a drone strike, we would still say that destabilizes the region, which the Ward evidence finds would cause a civil war, putting the entire population at risk. This outweighs the argument for two reasons. The first is that it's a prerequisite to their medicine argument because if they're in a war, you cannot distribute medicine. You're in a and all the crisis gets a lot worse. You can't distribute medicine. But also it's outweighs in the long term because infrastructure gets destroyed, which prevents people from getting out of poverty in the long term. We're impacting out to more people, so you should reverse there. Let's go to their case. The first response that you extend is the conceded analysis from Argus, which indicates that imports are increasing by 15% right now. Their only response is that it's only 15% of the population. But our analysis, the conceded part, is that trajectory is up because of things like the reform. That's really important because even if imports are not affecting everyone, it's comparatively better than before, which means we're solving back for all of the problems in the status quo. Now onto their weighing. They say that they outweigh on magnitude because 40,000 people. Well, number one, they don't show you how many people they affect because right now imports are going up. Their impact level is super muddled. But on top of that, it's not very comparative. We would say we impact out to the entire population through a civil war. But also on probability, this isn't real weighing because they've pretty much conceded our entire link chain. We have good probability here. But on their side, there's a pretty improbable because you extend a few responses. The first is that they say that Venezuela would have rebounded in 2018 because of oil, but they concede the analysis that their profits were going down because of mismanagement in the industry, which means that you don't actually know how much revenue would increase, which means that you don't know how many meds that they could have bought. Then they say that privatization was happening in 2017, but their evidence is just about like 47 private companies. Our evidence is very explicit in saying that you need privatization in the oil industry specifically. For these reasons, vote for us.
Ready for cross?
Yeah.
All right. Y'all can take the first question because you're first.
Right. So, is your military intervention evidence like that would lead to a military intervention? Is that specifically to like a drone strike, or like
it says it could do like a precision bombing or like a full.
Yeah. So how would like one precision bombing or like a small drone strike
lead to
like the entire infrastructure collapse?
Yeah. So first of all, you didn't bring this up in summary, so it's probably or in rebuttal. But second of all, we would say that number one, precision bombing would destroy infrastructure. Bombs. Pretty bad. But number two, if there's like
precision bombing minimizes like civilian casualties and civilian targets.
Sure, but they're still bombs, right?
Yeah,
you're still bombing the country.
You missed the analysis that it's gonna like destabilize.
Yeah, that's the second part, right?
Like,
Even if let's just say we have a sniper and it shoots Maduro in the head and he dies, right? Yeah. We would still say that destroys infrastructure because after the fact, there's a lot of destabilization. People are fighting over power, which destabilizes the region. That destroys infrastructure. All right. Yeah. Would you like another question?
Yeah, let's go. You said that they can use AUMF, but like Hezbollah is not a Al-Qaeda based.
Oh yeah, so our argument is that number one, it doesn't matter. AUMF is just like justifies the United States fighting terrorism across the globe.
But
number
there's
two,
a bipartisan effort in Congress to not go to war, which is the USA Today evidence.
Yeah, but our analysis was that he can just use it by himself, Trump.
Yeah, but there's no. But again, the rhetorical regime change still stands. Sure, it may be
it doesn't really stand.
Our evidence is very good to say that regardless, there's no reason to war.
Yeah, so your evidence is under like status quo conditions, right?
It's under any conditions.
The reason why it says that right now they're doing some rhetorical.
Your argument is that it's an alternative and that they need to go to other factors, right? Our argument is that not only is it unlikely, but Trump has literally never even planned to follow just blank threats,
so,
right?
Yeah, so that, we still respond to that. Our argument is that that's in the status quo with sanctions. He has no reason to consider a military intervention. But you can see the analysis that because he's using rhetoric, he would lose his credibility if he just ended pressure.
No, because when earlier in the year, in 2018, 2 years ago, Mike Pompeo said all options were on the table. But then later on, this article, the Freedom evidence says that Mike Pompeo, like all of them were like just bluffing. They wanted to rhetorically.
Right. I don't know where this was in any speeches, but on top of that, we would say that's under status quo conditions, right? The analysis, the important analysis.
Every response because you're saying status quo. That's not understanding the war and Trump argument. Our argument is that there's no military option ever considered. The only thing the Trump administration was ever trying to do was bluff. That's what they've been doing in Iran.
Okay, so I would say that you don't warrant that either.
Yeah, so because you can see the carded analysis that indicates without sanctions, the only other option Trump has left is military intervention.
Why?
Okay, can you give me another option?
Embargo.
Yeah, so if you brought those up in speeches, I would have frontlined them by saying.
Ask me a question.
Okay, yeah, I'm saying yeah, and if you brought those up in speeches, here's how I would have frontlined it. Number one, an OCO is less tangible, so it's not as aggressive or appeasing to the voters. An embargo is also seen as a step down from sanctions. Also, we're embargoing them right now, so it's not a big it's not a big deal. But also, if there was an embargo, a naval blockade, they would so we would say that either number one, that's like lower than sanctions, so it's still not as aggressive, or number two, a blockade would cripple the country, when still case it's offense for us. All right, do you have a question? All right.
going to start on their case and then come back to our case. We're starting at the top of their case. Is everybody ready? All right. The cleanest place to vote in this round is the Rockwell analysis that they really mishandled. Remember that Rockwell writes that in order for Venezuela to ever diversify, they need oil revenues first. That's specifically key because sanctions have reduced oil revenues a lot. In fact, our Rendon evidence that they also concludes that oil exports right now are going down 67%, and that it's the root cause of the oil collapse. Their only response is that that PDVSA is collapsing because of mismanagement. First of all, that's new in final focus. New in a second summary. That was never brought up in rebuttal or any other speech. And second of all, we tell you that the root cause is actually because they literally cannot make money when there's sanctions because there's no one to trade with. That means that the only way that the Venezuelan economy rebounds and diversifies, which leads to less recessions in the future, is if there's more oil revenue. Go to their argument about military intervention. There's a lot of problems here. First, they really mishandled the Frieden evidence that finds that every time Trump has threatened military intervention, it has been an attempt at a rhetorical regime change, and that his counsel told him that if you just yell loud enough and threaten enough, maybe the regime will collapse. They tell you that this is under the status quo, but our argument is that he literally has never planned to because it's completely unfeasible. No matter if the sanctions get lifted, that's not an option that is possible because all it is rhetoric. It's never been an actual threat. In order for their link to come true, it actually has to be a threat that means something. But then, remember the USA Today evidence that finds that it's bipartisanly unpopular. They tell you that Trump can use the AUMF, but remember that there's no link to Al-Qaeda in Venezuela. They can't attack, and additionally, he'll completely lose backing if he does so. Go on to our case. It's really clear where to vote here. That's off our second argument about imports. Remember, we tell you that specifically because of sanctions, the Sachs evidence finds that there's been a 5 times decrease of imports. Remember, that's been an 11 billion imports before 2017 to just 2 billion right now. They tell you that imports are rebounding right now, but remember that first, it isn't contextualized as to how much they're rebounding. They never tell you how many lives they're saving. And second, it's only accountable for 15% of the popularity. They tell you that it still indicates like a trajectory is going up. But remember that this is only for a few people, and even if you buy that the trajectory is going up, we act way faster because they're still trying to make up for the loss that sanctions originally caused, but we're able to immediately make up for that loss. Remember that we're able to say 4 million people currently lack medicine and 300,000 people are on the brink of death. We outweigh on magnitude because 40,000 people have already died. They tell you that imports are going up now, but we tell you that people have already died and will continue to do so. Then on probability, they said that we conceded the link chain. No, we did not. We tell you war was never intended, but what we do know is that people are dying right now. The best way to solve it is by voting pro and lifting sanctions.
Yeah. So the order is going to be our case, including the turn, and then their case. Okay. Okay. The round is completely over because they completely concede the weighing. Our argument about military intervention is a prerequisite to their entire case because if there's a military intervention which sparks a civil war, the people cannot distribute medicine because the entire country will be in shambles. But the second reason why we outweigh is because infrastructure is destroyed, which means that in the long term, Venezuela cannot bounce back. We have the only long-term impact. The only piece of weighing they read is magnitude weighing. They just say we impact 4,000 deaths, but they don't actually compare this to our argument. Our argument says that thousands or even millions will die because you put the entire country into shambles. That's why the first place you should look to in the round is military intervention. If we win any sort of office on this, the round is over. They only extend 2 responses. The first one is about a rhetorical analysis. They basically said there's never been planned to do in the past. Remember, the response still holds. That's under status quo conditions. Military intervention is the last resort, but without sanctions, the only option left is military intervention. They basically say that they can't plan it, but as they even tell you, you can literally send in a drone strike, you can send in troops. It doesn't take much planning. This is also a new response. Their second response says that they can't use a AUMF because like Hezbollah is not Al-Qaeda, but AUMF only applies to like terrorism threats, right? Hezbollah is still a terrorist group, which means that they can still enact an AUMF. At this point, the extension is super clean. The Rogan evidence says that Trump is pursuing a maximum pressure campaign, and the Ward evidence says that Trump must double down or else risk a foreign policy failure. And the Singleton evidence says that the reason why Trump has an aggressive stance in Florida is to appeal to the voters there, which means that if there's not sanctions, the only option left is military intervention. That's the Eberhard evidence, which they completely concede. And if there's a military intervention, regardless of what sort it is, it's going to spark a civil war because it's going to destabilize the entire region. If they see that like the main leader of Venezuela is killed, that's going to cause a lot of factions to start fighting, which ultimately kills thousands or even millions of people. Remember, at this point, the round is over. You only have to look at their offense. And on the turn about like the Rockwell thing about like needing revenues to diversify, 2 responses. First of all, they're not going to diversify. The internal link is revenues, but they can see the analysis that PDVSA was very corrupt and mismanaged. That means they would have run out of revenue. They can't diversify. Second of all, they don't read an impact off of this. It shouldn't be offense for them. And on imports, remember, we see that we can really muddle their link because we say that imports are rebounding right now. We don't know the like comparative advantage when you vote for them because on the one hand, imports are increasing. Maybe they increase a little more, but you don't know like what the net benefit is.
Good round.
Good job.